If you've been struggling to understand some of the psychic experiences that you've been having, and you want to know whether they're real or just your imagination, this episode is for you. Hi, and welcome back to the Spiritual Freedom Show with Richard Lawrence, the podcast helping seekers of truth, spirituality, and psychic powers to discover true fulfillment. My name is Darren Ball, I'm the co-host of the show, and in this episode we're going to be sharing with you the extraordinary story of one of Richard's earliest psychic experiences. We're also going to be sharing specific tips and insights from Richard, who has decades of his own psychic experience that can help you to spot the difference between your imagination and genuine psychic perception. We're even going to be sharing the story of a famous poet and artist from the 18th century, someone who was written off as a madman at the time and even today, and yet someone who is having his own genuine psychic and spiritual experiences. But let's see what you think. Let us know in the comments at the end of the video. Now, I'll just preface this a little bit by saying that in the beginning of your spiritual question, I'm sure you can resonate with this too, Richard, is that it can be difficult to understand some of the early experiences that you have in the beginning. I think, I can certainly cast my mind back and I can think about that for myself. And I certainly struggle with the certainty that they were something real. That's what I was feeling at the time. And sometimes I just wasn't sure, and I would have loved to have known better how I could have told the difference. I think that would have given me more confidence in the experiences I was having and also the experiences in the path that I was taking to at the time. So maybe I can turn it to you then. Maybe if you want to start perhaps with maybe an experience or story that might be able to lead us into this from your early days that might help to elucidate this for people.
Well, thanks, Darren. Yeah. One thing I could say is that over the years I've done, I don't know, could probably be hundreds now of phone-in shows on the radio, and often I would do it about unlock your psychic powers, which you mentioned. I would say on every occasion, many, possibly dozens of callers who would tell me they'd had an experience, a psychic experience, or they didn't know whether it was a psychic experience. Now, these were people who wouldn't call themselves psychics. They didn't know where to go with it. They've always wondered about it. Something happened to them, which could be anything from seeing a relative who's died, they felt. They might think it's a ghost, to sensing somebody around, to having a very acute premonition that then came true. There's lots of people out there having these things going on. Often they don't really get down to finding out what it is. See, one thing it's telling them is that they can be psychic. To come to the question, though, am I psychic? Or is it my imagination, which is what a lot of people ask. And we're kind of conditioned a bit to say it's imagination, to dismiss it. These things don't really happen, and put it aside.
It's a great way to put it.
One thing I can say is that everybody can be psychic. That I know. I've taught hundreds, if not thousands of people in various classes around the world to unlock their psychic powers. They have realized they have that ability. They've experienced something. But it's got to be done safely, because you can enter what Dr. George King would have called a negative trance.
Okay.
Unless you have certain abilities, and the main one is the power of concentration. Otherwise, your mind can slip off. So, long answer, and I haven't yet given you what you actually asked me for. So I must be a politician then. But just wanted to say that there's lots of people out there having these experiences. Now, that isn't to say in some cases they aren't imagination.
Sure.
In some cases people are having wishful thinking and so on, or they're bereaved, and but it doesn't matter if you don't know. What I would say, and to be positive, you can train yourself, though, if you choose to, so that you will know the difference between those two things. In the meantime, it's best to keep an open mind. Don't write it off. This is just imagination, because it might not be. Don't assume it's psychic. Train yourself, develop yourself, and you can get to a stage where you can tell the difference. Now, as far as my experience is concerned, one of the very first clairvoyant experiences I had, because you mentioned a particular poet and an artist, and that individual was I would say for sure a clairvoyant, which is psychic vision.
Agree. Yeah. Okay.
That's not my first suit, but it is something I have developed, and I was able to see. And the way I'd put it, it'd be like in my mind's eye, that old saying, and it's quite literally true, actually, of psychic development. Some would call it the third eye, but the third eye, although it's located, technically it's located between the eyebrows, but in the aura in front of you. Most people who feel they're looking through the third eye are not. They're looking through a lower center. It seems to be there. I would say very, very often, in general, it'll be an activation of a lower chakra, which is the solar plexus center, particularly in the earlier stages. It can still be very good. The difference between the two, having now experienced both, which I hadn't at one time, is that when you're looking through the real third eye, you're looking at reality, you're looking at something real.
I see.
Whereas when you are looking through you're getting a psychic impression from a lower so let's say the solar plexus center,
yeah.
it comes as an impression of reality. It still can be very revealing and very accurate, but there is a difference. But that's not something anyone needs to worry about at the moment, probably, but it's interesting to me.
Yeah, it is.
It's one of the reasons I really set out to really look through the third eye, because I got kind of fed up with impressions after a while. But impressions can be very helpful. So the first experience, this was your actual question, or one of the first, was when I was in Switzerland. And this would be, I'd be probably in my very late 20s at the time, I should think. And I was visiting a friend of Dr. King's. I worked for Dr. King, and this gentleman lived there in Switzerland and was supportive of Dr. King's work. And I went to visit him and to show him some slides and to bring him up to speed on some of the things that Dr. King was engaged in, and just talk to him and spend some time with him.
Yeah.
And as I sat there, I suddenly saw very marked impression of a military gentleman, down to I could describe what he was wearing, and he had military dress and so on. And I could see him so that's the first thing, was that I could see him there.
Okay.
And then it's quite a long story, but I told this friend of Dr. King's, whose first name was Eric. I said, Eric, there's somebody here, and he looked a bit worried. I thought, are you all right? What's going on?
So he's questioning whether it's your...
Well, he just wondered. He has a young chap comes to visit him, and he's seeing things in my room.
Yeah.
Which I can understand. Although he was a believer in psychic things.
Sure. Yeah.
So I was then I heard in my mind's ear, which is a more prevalent thing for me, and especially became such.
Okay.
I developed clairaudience, which is psychic hearing. You could say that you could call it the inner eye, the inner ear, or the mind's eye, the mind's ear, because it's all an aspect of mind. It's just an aspect that we don't tap generally. He said, "Tell Eric he's an ass."
That's a bit weird.
So I didn't do that. Anyway, then he said, "Go to the bookcase and pull out such and such an encyclopedia," which I did. He said, "Look up the name Rommel." I could hear this sort of as an impression again.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But I could hear kind of a bit of an accent with it.
Okay.
So it wasn't just words in my head. And I had never done anything like this before. I was practicing the crystal ball gazing.
Okay.
I was doing readings, or learning to. I hadn't had a thing like this happen to me before. So then he said, look up the name Rommel. Looked up. Long story short, it described a particular general at the very start of that war that was connected to, I think, possibly captured by Rommel, the beginning of the war. And it gave his name. And so I gave the name Major General so-and-so. And Eric said, Uncle Vic.
Wow.
That was his uncle. So the odds of this is the kind of thing that is very reassuring to a developing psychic, because I knew, I didn't.
There's no way you could have...
It wasn't the surname. He didn't have that. He was on the mother's side. I had no idea of his mother's maiden name or anything about his family. So people can disbelieve it. They can say, well, you went over and concocted a story and blah and blah and blah. If they want to, it doesn't matter to me at all. I knew what had happened. And that's the kind of thing that is like an acid test. And the point being was not a show of ability, that's irrelevant. It's then Vic gave me a particular message he wanted to pass on to Eric. To do with his passing, which didn't happen. I never saw him again after that. He's an elderly gentleman.
Okay.
And they were, his uncle and others, I'm sure, were preparing to help him and would be with him. It was a very nice message, kind of thing that mediums quite often get. I don't do that so much now, but I used to. But it was a confirmation to me, at least, okay, because he was a military general. He was a major general. He would have had, this is how he dressed and how he looked at formal occasions.
Yeah. Well, I find, just going back to a few things there. One is that we can all develop these psychic abilities. I think it gives us confidence that this is possible. It's not, we can't just rule it out at the offset like that. And then secondly, that you had this type of experience where you had this sort of outside validation of these different elements of it, based on, not only the message he gave, which Eric was, shocked by, but also the individual details that you could see. It kind of reinforces that even the visual element that you were perceiving.
I had no knowledge of anything to do with Eric's lineage or whether it was military or not, or the names or anything. So it was good for me. But, as I often used to say to psychics, I used to do a show on LBC in Britain, a radio station, regularly, called the Phenomena Files. It's the most listened to radio show in London on a Saturday night. Beat all the BBC channels at the time.
That's
it was
good.
Saturday night. But anyway, we had a lot of psychics would come in and they would demonstrate their abilities. And they were quite remarkable abilities that some of them had. But I always would question, and they were friends of mine, I would talk to them. I'd say, well, actually, is that helpful? I mean, you told the chap he was wearing a green tie. You couldn't have known that. It wasn't set up because we chose the callers at the station. But how much has that helped him? So it's not about displaying your abilities. There are various ways. The very, very best way to really get to the truth of your experiences is through the power of intuition, which is slightly different from psychic abilities. But to start with, though, people are having these things. And there's one little tip I would give. Never lose 3 words. No matter how far you get, never lose them. Even Dr. King would use them sometimes. And those words are, I don't know.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't know whether it's real, imaginary, or what it is. You might be driving in a car. You haven't got time to think, and something pops in your head, and you think, is that a premonition? Is it a what? If it turns out to be true, you can look back at it, and you can think, gosh, what was that? Was it my own intuition? Was it a guide telling me? I remember one of the callers in one of these radio shows, and this is just anecdotes that were given. I do remember this one, was a parachutist in the army.
Oh, yeah.
And he was about to jump out of a plane, and some of the military actually are quite believers in psychic things, and Air Force, and Navy probably too. But anyway, he heard these words, check your parachute, which is meant to have been checked. And so before he jumped, he triple checked it or checked it out, and it hadn't been packed properly.
Oh, wow.
Now, his question, well, what was that? Well, who was that?
Who was that?
Was that me? And in the end, in a way, it doesn't matter because he acted on it. Yeah. And he says it saved his life.
I think that, the tip you give there about, being able to say, I don't know. I mean, when I think back, I can think of experiences where if I just said even to myself, I don't know, I think it would have helped me because then it would have avoided some of the self-doubt or other things that crept in later when I was trying, I wanted to believe that it was real, but I wasn't really sure. And then when it doesn't work out, then you really question yourself. Yeah. But if I just said, well, I don't know, then I wouldn't have undermined, the confidence that I had in the real psychic experience that I was having at the time. And to be able to, say, I don't know, I think helps you with the psychic experience that definitely are real, that you do have.
And I think one thing we're fighting is conditioning, especially in this modern age, in the so-called civilized world, whereas in certain more indigenous, primitive, tribal groupings and so on, they wouldn't be fighting this kind of conditioning. We are sort of programmed to think the only thing that we've got is our reason, our intellect, and so I do think there's some high-powered intellectuals who dismiss psychic awareness, which must come from the intensity of their concentration, because they don't believe in it. They're conditioned to say, well, I can't get information like that in any other way. Can only get it through deduction, through analysis.
Yeah.
But some of the greatest ones, the greatest artists, and indeed some of the greatest scientists, did openly know and state that imagination was a more valuable tool to achieving some of the things they discovered even than reason. The thing is, the two go together. I know he's not the painter you mentioned, but another painter, and a very, very great one, is Francisco Goya.
Go ahead.
And he's very interesting. I'm no art expert. I mean, my wife is, but I'm not. But this is a quote from him. "Imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters." It's a translation, of course, from Spanish. "United with her," that's imagination united with reason, "she is the mother of the arts and the source of their wonders." So he attributed imagination to be a source and a way to find truth.
Okay.
So, for example, from what little I do know, when he was painting, let's just say, the Duke of Wellington, he wasn't looking upon it as a sort of glorified photograph, not that photographs really existed properly then, but he wasn't just trying to duplicate the physical image he saw in front of him. He was using his imagination in his art. He's called it his imagination, to get inside the Duke of Wellington, to reveal the truth of the persona of the Duke of Wellington through his art.
Well, this is a fascinating point, because the way we frame the question almost makes it seem like imagination is a bad thing.
Yeah.
But actually, it's not that we're saying imagination is a bad thing. We're just saying there is a difference between that experience and the objective perception of things through your psychic senses. But imagination still has this really important role.
Yeah. Well, there's a brilliant lecture by Dr. George King, which I recommend, and people can go to Audio Cloud and have access to this and other lectures. And this one is about imagination, your only creative faculty. And he makes the amazing statement in it, actually, that I think he says even a truck driver who became a really good truck driver, it started in his imagination, or her imagination, actually. You know, at one point, they must have imagined themselves being that brilliant truck driver. And then later, you know, through skill, through concentration, through aptitude, they become that.
Do you mean that that's like the starting point for bringing something into reality, into manifestation? I mean,
it is. You can visualize. I mean, the one thing I will say about the visualizations that are taught, say in Realize Your Inner Potential, which I co-authored with Dr. George King, which has got 42 wonderful practices in, I think it's over 40 anyway. I use them myself. I didn't invent them. They come from Dr. King as the source, not me. But the visualization exercises there are based on truth. They're based on reality. So there's one exercise, for example, in it called the Violet Flame Practice, which is a wonderful practice. It's a very ancient one, actually. Anyone can use it. It can bring protection. It can bring purification. It's a wonderful preparatory practice. It's a wonderful transmuter of lower, unwanted thoughts, and I would call them blockages in our auric system, which are stopping higher inspiration from coming in as well, by the way. But the point I'm making there, we start by imagining it. We start by visualizing it. But because it really exists, there comes a point when we really contact it as a reality. We've used imagination there to contact something that is true, something that is real. And you can get to the point where I've met people, I haven't done this myself, who smelt it. I've certainly felt absolutely and seen it completely enclose me. And when I was in my bedroom once, not just me, but the whole room and the whole bed.
Wow.
But it's all started with imagining something that was real. And that's the difference between, say, the visualization practices that we teach and some visualization practices which are based on fantasy and invention only. And they don't connect you necessarily with a reality.
Wow, that's a profound point. I mean, and to come back to, how would you distill the difference then, I think, between a psychic experience or, you know, perceiving something through your psychic senses and the use of imagination, and how, someone who's having an experience, which maybe either one of those would be able to tell the difference.
Well, I mentioned intuition,
Yeah.
and I broaden that out, especially for, as it were, for beginners. It's a certain feeling that you recognize.
Okay.
It's a certain, I call it getting into a certain groove. And everyone has their own way into that groove. And when you're in it, you know you're in it after a while, and you know you're on. I knew a very famous psychic, actually, who was very famous about 50 years ago in Britain, called Doris Collins.
Okay.
And she used to go out and do big demonstrations. I don't know, it was the Albert Hall, but very big venues. And she'd do what I would call pretty basic psychic readings, actually. Did you have a child called Hugh who's died? Well, he's here tonight. Okay. To people in the audience and so on. But when she trained for a while, and she was the assistant to another psychic, she told me.
Okay.
And then one day he was ill, and the event had been booked. And he said to her, well, you'll have to go on. And she said, well, I can't do it. She'd been training for a while.
Okay.
But she said, I can't do this. He said, it's easy, you can. You just start talking.
I see.
And you just see what comes into your head. Now, don't get me wrong. Most people who tried that would fall flat on their face. And I'm not recommending that as a methodology at all. But in her particular case, she felt like she was inventing it. But she was saying, well, madam, you had a son called Hugh. And the madam said, I did. And he did die. And so she was then using, there is that link. There was a great mystic and teacher I thoroughly recommend, actually, called Motoyama.
Okay.
Hiroshi Motoyama, Japanese, but moved to I think to either South America or America later. But he said a very brilliant thing, actually. He said that to the average person, the psychotic and the genius look exactly the same because they are both talking nonsense, possibly, what sounds like nonsense to most people. But the difference is the genius has tapped into a higher reality. The psychotic has uncontrolled imagination and fantasy, uncontrolled. But it's so different from where the ordinary person is at. There's that whole thing like the balance between insanity and genius. They look the same, but they're actually the opposite. One you might say is a kind of a negative trance condition in a way.
Like you said.
The other is a positive, induced, brought about through concentration. Every really great genius in whatever field has unusually advanced powers of concentration. And such a person will tap in, whatever they call it. They can call it their imagination, they could call it something else, they can call it their muse or an angelic guidance or numerous other things, but they'll start to tap into something which is above reason, above intellect, is a higher power, and I would say an activation of a higher psychic center.
Well, I would say that's a great intro to the person that we wanted to talk about today. I mean, because he's someone who was actually seen in exactly that way, wasn't he? I mean, some people believe that he was a madman, a psychotic, perhaps even was schizophrenic. I think some people later labeled him.
Still do, some people.
True.
Yeah.
But, I think you can look at some of his experience, and if you really delve into a little bit more about him and his history, and you look at some of his quotes, I think it really reveals a deeper understanding. Let me just, so this man is called William Blake. A lot of people may know him from his poem, Tiger, Tiger. That's a very famous one.
Bright.
Yeah. I actually didn't know that was him.
I'll tell you another thing he wrote. And did those days in ancient times walk upon England's pastures?
That was him, was it?
Jerusalem.
Okay.
Which actually was the anthem of the British Conservative Party. This isn't a political point one way or the other, but there you had sort of what they used to call the Blue Rinse Brigade. They used to call this, sort of very conservative English people who, Women's Institute, etc., used to be, I'll say this now, were all singing away at this. And actually the words of it say that, and did those walk upon England's pastures green. Actually what it says is that Jesus came to England. And that isn't part of the church teaching at all.
That's
but it is true. So there's an example of someone who hit upon a truth.
Yes. Yeah.
He didn't have access to that knowledge other than...
That's a great example of that.
Mystical, and that's a very famous hymn, Jerusalem.
I think it was, if I go back a little through his history, read about him. I mean, he even had visions as a child. I think there's one case he talks about walking through Peckham Rye and he saw a tree like shining full of angels.
Yeah, let's go to Peckham.
Yeah, it sounds like. And then, it's recorded that he would see people at his bedroom window, and even when he's older, he'd see prophets, other people that he wanted to discuss.
He had regular contact with
who
had died.
Yeah, who had died, exactly. So these, I think also...
He was a clairvoyant, straight medium.
Clearly, yeah.
And,
because he had read widely in spirituality and alchemy, I think, even Egyptian mythology. So he was someone who was actively studying these things.
Yeah.
And I think it's clear as well, when you look for someone's art to have survived like that and to have been so inspired in some of the things that he shared. I mean, it's clearly there's something more deeper that he's tapping into.
And he said there was. I mean, one of the things he said is he's got, I don't remember the exact phraseology, but I've got more books on the heavenly spheres published or written than I have on this one. Actually, he was very unsuccessful on this one. He had to work, didn't he, as a printer? I don't think he sold a painting.
I think he died in poverty.
And now they're all worth millions. So.
Yeah. It all seems, like you say, that people aren't really appreciating their time, particularly when people can't tell the difference that you describe between a madman and a genius. And one of them is actually tapping into something a lot higher, a lot more profound. And I think he certainly was.
What I find slightly irksome is I did read a recent sort of scholarly piece about him in the last 10 years, where the writer praised his work, and this was mainly his poetry, but at the same time said he was schizophrenic and that the schizophrenia produced this work. Well, I'm sorry, if you have a mental health issue, that isn't going to produce that kind of work. You might be capable of that kind of work, and you might have mental health issues, but it's not going to be a result of it. And so and of course, all the time, he was trying to avoid saying that he actually was seeing a grey monk, or whatever he claimed to, and receiving dictation as he wrote and so forth, because that was too much for this scholarly person to accept. And yet he didn't know it was untrue. So it's very unscholarly of him.
Yeah, true. And actually it speaks to like what you said earlier, that typically, people, even though they might have advanced powers of concentration, may block out that and refuse to acknowledge or dismiss even the possibility that it might be something more that they're tapping into.
Absolutely.
Let me just share with you a quote actually by William Blake, and I'd love to get your insight into it. I'll read this for you here. He goes, "This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and leads you to believe a lie when you see with, not through, the eye."
That's incredible, because you told me about this quote yesterday, I think, for the first time. I'd never heard that before. And yet you've been on my workshops. And when I'm teaching people, as I do, to see the aura, I don't mean in depth, but I am able to teach, I would say at least half of a group in one session is able, by the end of that group, and these aren't trained psychics, to see an aura. By that I mean get a glimpse of it. And a glimpse of something that is sustainable, not a photoelectric effect.
Sure, yeah.
The one thing I always say to them as a little help along the way is look through the eyes, not with the eyes. And then you tell me that's what Blake said, who was a clairvoyant. So that can only come from someone who's done it.
Sure.
I know that because
from experience,
I used to do crystal gazing, and Dr. King actually set me up. He actually bought my first crystal ball. He designed my crystal ball cover for me, and I started giving readings in my late 20s, and he was right behind me on that. And he also gave me some tips and some help. But what I discovered, because if you know about crystal gazing at all, and I'm not saying everybody has to do this, it's just what I want. I wanted to do it actually. To me, it wasn't a sort of European thing. It was a Taoist thing.
Okay.
That's how I saw it. The void that has to be filled.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I saw it in that way. But we're all different. But to me, that was a little key for me to get started. What happens, gazers will tell you, is that they say it mists up. It becomes like a mist, and then into that mist you start to see images. I don't need the crystal ball. I told Dr. King after a while, okay, it's got me going, I don't need it now. He said, keep it as a prop. So, it's quite a nice thing to have there sometimes, although I really don't need it now. But the mist I'm talking about, I believe, is the blurring of the eyesight, going out of physical focus.
Okay.
This is quite a little key here. It's not enough. You'll need to train to do a lot more than just this, but and be careful. Don't try this and go into a negative trance. You'd need to have a spiritual practice regime, which we can give you through the Spiritual Freedom Show. But this is one of the things that happens. Your eyes blur over. They go out of focus. So you can't actually look with them because they aren't focused. And then you look through them. And then actually what you are doing then actually is tapping the eye. Here's an interesting thing. The ancient Greek legends, some will know, talk about a cyclops. And the cyclops, I mean, the ancient Greek legends are full of sort of not just mythology, but superstition and deviation and man-made love affairs and anger and things. It's a shame because a lot of it, I believe, goes back to a very early time in history, possibly even Atlantis.
Wow, yeah, okay.
But what the Cyclops actually was, or is depicted at, is a giant figure with one eye. Mm-hmm. And that's a very symbolic, that's telling me, that they can look through the eye. You know, as Erasmus said, the one-eyed man is king in the kingdom of the blind. By which he's not talking, I don't believe. I think it's much deeper than people take it
like
to
wisdom
be.
he's talking about.
He's talking there not about just being, physically blind, because you can be physically blind and extremely wise, much more than people who've got eyesight. It's not just about that. But where people can't see truth, the one-eyed man is king. That's looking through the third eye.
I think it's a wonderful one to end on there. Thank you, Richard. Now, what I loved about that episode is that we can all train ourselves to be able to tell the difference between our imagination and the objective world that can be perceived through our psychic centers. But let's not paint imagination in a bad light either, because it's that rare and beautiful alchemy between reason and imagination that can lead to profound scientific insights and also incredible, profound works of art beyond what the intellect might have achieved on its own. We're just saying that if you can tell the difference between imagination and genuine psychic experience, then that will give you a lot more confidence in the experiences that you are having, especially in the face of the mainstream conditioning today, where a lot of these things are completely dismissed and ignored. People might have completely dismissed William Blake in his lifetime as a madman, but the legacy of his genuine and profound spiritual experiences lives on in his incredibly inspired works of art that we have today. Now, if you enjoyed that episode about psychic powers, be sure to check out this video over here that goes deep into the raw truth about mediumship and channeling, or this video over here if you'd like to learn more about clairvoyance, psychic vision, and what it's really like. Thanks for tuning into the show. See you next time.